All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Holt, and I'm Zpryme's Digital Media Manager. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar presented by Copperleaf, How to Build a Better Business Case for Utility Asset Investment Planning. Now, before I hand things over to our moderator and panelists, I want to let you know that we do want you to ask questions during the webinar. You can use the Q&A box in the bottom right corner of the WebEx window to submit your questions, and we will take some time at the end of the webinar to have our speakers answer as many as we have time for. If you have any trouble with audio or video, try refreshing your WebEx browser or closing out and then signing back in. Also, the slides and webinar recording will be available after the webinar is complete, so don't worry about missing a thing. We usually get them up on our site within a day or two, and you'll receive an email linking you to both the slide deck and webinar playback. Okay, so now we can get to what you all came for. I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Hardick, research analyst and today's moderator, to give you an overview of some Zpryme research.
Thank you, Chris. Again, my name is Aaron Hardick, and I'm a research analyst for Zpryme. Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. We're excited to have you all join us today. So today we're going to discuss how to build a better business case for utility asset investment planning. When it comes to asset investment planning, how can utilities know they are making the right decisions to deliver both reliability and value to their stakeholders and their organizations? In today's webinar, we'll dive into how utilities can use systems to build asset planning strategies. We'll also discuss how the conversation is really focused around reliability, the benefits and challenges brought about by ever-evolving technology in the industry, and how integrated systems can provide information to help drive value. So we're excited to have some experts with us for today's webinar. We have Boudewijn Neijens, Chief Marketing Officer of Copperleaf, and Javier Fernandez, the Chief Financial Officer at Omaha Public Power District. Now, before I turn things over to our experts today, I just wanted to share some research with you that we completed earlier this year. Utilities are recognizing the importance of asset management to support both emerging and existing assets. Smart grid and renewable energy initiatives really unleashed not only new assets and greater connections, but also more data that utilities can use to better understand their assets. So in this first chart, we can see that 52% of utilities say asset management is a high priority compared to other business efforts within their organizations. Next, we'll look at the importance of capital planning and asset management. When thinking about assets in a connected environment, real-time and predictive efforts may come to mind first. Although real-time asset management efforts are critical, another important perspective is the long-term view of assets for capital planning purposes. So looking at our chart, we see over 2/3 of utilities list capital planning as a high priority in their asset management and investment strategies. So next we'll look at the value of integrating certain applications for asset management. Many applications are important for understanding assets, and the integration among them can really help release the best visibility into asset health and planning. In our chart here, we can see some of the key areas for integration, including APM to real-time systems and EAM to APM. And last, we'll look at how well these applications are integrated today. So over a quarter of utilities say the integrations are not going well at all, and 41% noted that it's going fairly well. So what this means is there really is room for improvement in integrating these applications. So that's it for our Zpryme research introduction. Before I turn things over to our panelists, I just wanted to remind you that you can use the Q&A chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to ask questions. We will address them during the Q&A portion at the end of today's webinar. So with that, I will turn things over to Javier.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, actually, most of you. My name is Javier Fernandez. I'm the Chief Financial Officer with the Omaha Public Power District. And I've only been with the district for less than a year. And prior to joining the Omaha Public Power District, I was a CFO at the Bonneville Power Administration, which is another large utility on the West Coast. And both utilities, in my experience as a CFO, few topics ever came to the executive discussion with the same importance as asset management. And so what I would like to talk to you today is a little bit about my perspective as a CFO of a utility and where I see asset management going and what is the case to be built around improving our asset management practices, which I believe is at the core of any of us working in the utility industry. So with that, just providing a little bit of context, this is particular to my utility here at OPPD, but many other utilities probably share similar statistics where about 2/3 of our annual budget is invested in building new assets. The other third is in fuel or administrative tasks that are not directly related to our assets, but by and large, the majority of our budget is spent on our assets. Building new assets, replacing them, operating and maintaining them, you name it. Unfortunately, my experience in the utility industry is that the majority of our energy is usually focused on new assets. My experience is that we focus a lot of our effort and a lot of our discussions are on when it's time to replace a new asset. Prioritization of capital, which asset goes first, how much we spent on the new asset or replacing existing assets, and typically the conversation around O&M, operating and maintenance dollars, and stretching the life of an asset is something that hasn't risen in my experience to the same level as the capital prioritization, where I believe that the operating and maintenance of those assets is probably way more important than investing in new capital. I believe that when a new piece of equipment is installed, we're going to spend at least 10, if not 15 times more on that equipment than the equipment is worth itself. So there's a lot of opportunity for utilities, at least in my experience, to start tying information about condition of assets. How much are we spending on operations and maintenance of those assets? Are we getting the value out of those assets to the extent that we have to extract that value, and only replace those assets when it is absolutely necessary? At the same time, making decisions about when to decommission assets becomes even more important, as opposed to just carrying a fleet of assets that don't necessarily provide the value to the district. From a utilities perspective, this is a super easy chart, and most of you in the audience are familiar with the concept of a vertically integrated utility, where we have generation. In the case of OPPD, where we're running fossil fuel plants, but we're also running a pretty healthy fleet of wind farms. For the generation side, we have plenty of demands on the asset side. We also have to maintain and build out transmission systems, distribution systems. As population continues to grow, our assets continue to decay, and now we have to run lines to places in our region where we didn't have to use to run those lines. Those are typically the two largest capital categories that we have in the district. However, none of these would work if we don't have a healthy investments on our infrastructure technology, information technology, customer service technology, and all of the support services, fleet services, facilities, all of the peripheral services that make the utility work. So that those two are included in the customers and stakeholders and business support. Typically, without a robust asset management process, the prioritization process for capital becomes a real challenge for any utility, where the most visible assets are those that are in the generation side or transmission and distribution, and those are the assets where we typically tend to invest the majority of our dollars. And don't get me wrong, I think that is very much the case. But how do we have a system that prioritizes those investments and puts them on the same level playing field as buying new information technology? The right investments on facilities, on fleet. It becomes harder and harder the more diverse the assets that we have in the portfolio for us to prioritize. So a little bit of context too, from OPPD's perspective, we virtually are transforming this utility. We were virtually we didn't have any wind in our fleet 6 years ago. We had almost no wind in our fleet 6 years ago, and now we are, as of today, we are producing about 35% of the power that's sold to our customers. 35% comes from renewable sources, mainly wind. That is today, and we believe that this percentage is going to go to 50% by 2020. So in a matter of 6 years, we're transforming this utility, basically replacing power with renewable power to the tune of 50% in 6 years. That is phenomenal. As if you live in the district, you're excited. We're running power from cleaner sources. We're doing the right thing for the environment. We're doing all of these things while we're not increasing rates. Reliability standards continue to increase, and even with that, those higher standards, we're still able to integrate all of this wind into our system. Now, what this means from an asset perspective is, well, we've had to add new generation assets. We have a fleet that looks very different, that operates very different than the fleet that we had before. That means that now we're also installing a lot of these wind farms in places in the state where we didn't have transmission lines. So it's building new transmission lines, building distribution systems that now have to integrate all of these new technology that we're trying to absorb. And at the same time, let's not forget about decommissioning those old assets that faithfully provided power for decades, and now we have to decommission those. And it takes quite a bit of money to decommission those. So transforming a utility is, to me, probably one of the most important asset management topics that any utility has to deal with. From an enterprise risk, as we're transforming the utility, probably the single most important risk that we are facing as a utility is the stranded risk. Stranded asset risk. With limited resources, we want to make sure that we're only investing in those assets that will be utilized for as much as we can for the duration of that asset. It is very possible that we may invest in assets today whose technology may become obsolete in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years. We may invest in a transmission line to connect a specific source of power to a specific load, and that specific source of power may not be there in 5 or 10 years. So the risk of stranded assets is very, very much at the forefront of the executive conversation in the district. We also want to make sure that we invest enough in our assets to avoid system congestions and operational failure. Population continues to rise, and we have a fiduciary and a legal obligation to serve all of our customers. We need to make sure that we invest at least the minimum level of investment, if not a little bit more, to have higher reliability in the system. Suboptimal market integration, that's a really, really important one for us, and this touches on information technology. To the extent that we do not invest in information technology and we continue to invest just in the steel on the ground and wires in the air, we could be missing out on opportunities to better integrate to markets. For all of us who work in the utility world, being integrated with RTOs and efficient markets is incredibly important. So as we continue to produce power and sell and buy power in the market, our ability to integrate into those markets is incredibly important. And so making sure that we make those right investments on our information technology front becomes now more important than it has ever been, in my opinion. As we get more connected into the markets, the risks of cybersecurity and all the threats to the grid become even more visible. And so we need to make sure that we continue to invest on those systems to protect us from cyber attacks. All of this requires a lot of money, and if we didn't have that governing factor, then the solution would be easy. Let's just invest a lot of money on pretty much everything that I just mentioned. However, we have obviously limited resources. We have to remain competitive. We have to maintain low rates for our customers. So maintaining that competitiveness with our customers with low rates at the same time as we achieve high reliability and we invest in all of these assets is probably one of the toughest equations to solve in the utility world. I have two maps here in front of you that, to me, it tells the story really well. These are the generating capacity retirements. In the last decade, the dots that you see in front of you represent all of the plants that have been retired or are in the process of being retired or decommissioned in the United States. You can see the majority of them are coal. Those are the darker dots, and you have gas plants that have been retired as well. So lots of plants continue to be retired either because of age or because of economics or because of environmental issues. But this is the fleet of generating plants that has been retired in the past 10 years in the United States. Conversely, as we retire all of these plants, we have to replace all of that power with something else. And that power has been replaced with the following slide. And you can see the new generating capacity, predominantly green. You see a lot of green dots. That's wind. You see quite a few yellow dots on the coast, especially in California. That's solar. So as we decommission plants that were, for the most part, fossil fuel plants, now we're replacing a lot of that power with wind and solar and a few other technologies as well. So the location of those plants, the technology, the nature of those plants makes our integration of all of these assets incredibly hard. What this means for OPPD is in 2010, our fleet we had 56% of our fleet was coal, 15% nuclear, 26% gas, and just a little bit of hydro and wind. As I mentioned earlier, in just a matter of 6 years, we have completely transformed the utility. Where now 45% of our power comes from coal, nothing from nuclear, and we have significantly ramped up wind resources as we keep our gas and hydro flat. So all in all, a great story, but it has required a lot of our resources, and we've had to make a lot of decisions. I dream for a time where we could make all these decisions with perfect information, and of course that has not been the case today. That's the reason we're on this webinar. Is we continue to find ways to get better information so that we can make better asset management decisions in the future. My goal as a CFO is for me to sit in front of my board of directors and my boss, the CEO, and look at them in the eye and tell them we are investing the right amount of money in the right assets at the right time, and we are maximizing the value of our stakeholders. I think we're doing that. I think we're doing that today, but I don't have all the data behind it to confirm that, and I believe that's one of the reasons why we're all trying to improve our asset information systems, condition-based management, having the right tools in front of us so that we can make these claim to our governing board. And with that, I'll stop there and let you ask any questions you have.
All right, thank you, Javier. We're going to move on to Boudewijn, and then we will take questions after we see Boudewijn's presentation. Boudewijn?
Good morning or afternoon. For me, it's still morning. I'm in Vancouver. Thank you, Javier, for that. Those thoughts. I think those were spot on, really. And I will try to build on that. First, by finding my first slide. There you go. So, indeed, how do you build a better business case for investment planning, which is what it's all about? And really, if I kind of listen to Javier and I kind of try to distill it down to one slide, this would be the one, which is at any point in time, my challenge is that I have a large number of possible investments, and I say investments in the wide sense of the word. Could be small project, could be massive new builds, and I have a couple of constraints that essentially I am under. And again, at the highest level, I think what I heard from Javier is reliability is the big driver on the one side, reliability in the broad sense of the whole system, and of course constrained by money in the sense that he cannot raise his rates, and therefore he has to deliver at the lowest cost. Now, of course, if the world were this simple, then we'd all be laughing. But I think what we did here is that clearly, in reality, and if my button were to work, there you go. Really, you're trying to achieve a long list of objectives at the same time, and you're also constrained in multiple different ways. So we heard about, on the objective side, we heard about, alleviating the congestion, the fact that you have to bring in renewables, the fact that you have expansion that you have to work on, customer satisfaction, of course, is a key objective, risk management. We heard about cybersecurity, and of course, there's numerous risks. So we have multiple objectives that we're trying to chase at the same time and somehow please everybody at the same time. And we're also constrained, of course, by money and by rates, also, of course, by the resources that we can throw at it, possibly by our own risk tolerance. That could also be seen as a constraint. I do not want to take on more risk than X. We might have seasonal constraints. Javier was mentioning just before we started the call that it's bitter cold out there in Omaha right now, so I assume some projects just cannot be executed right now. You have to wait until the weather is good enough to actually work on particular assets, and that's certainly true here in Canada. So timing of your project might be a constraint. The level of service that you have to deliver by law or by regulation might be constrained. So you wind up with a very complex environment in which you're trying to actually make your decisions, and the risk of indeed leaving money on the table is very high. So in other words, as Javier was saying, how do I make sure that I actually am delivering, that I'm spending the right amount of dollars at the right time and delivering the maximum value? That is not a trivial question, and actually I would argue that most of us are not there yet because we don't have perfect information and we don't have perfect systems to actually get us there. So let's see to which extent we can actually improve on things. You could argue that there is indeed, as Javier said, two sources of fund spending primarily. There is the existing asset base, which of course needs to be sustained, either in O&M, but of course also by effectively reinvesting in it at the right time, as Javier mentioned. So not too early, not too late, but you have to do your sustainment investments to actually keep the assets running, at least the ones that you're consider to be useful and that should be sustained. And then, of course, I think as was very clear, there is a big shift going on. So in other words, expansion, modernization, operational improvements, change of function is something which is becoming increasingly important in utilities, which for a long time ran pretty much business as usual, and it is not business as usual anymore. So you have this creative tension between how much money should I put in my existing assets, how much money should I put into new projects, which actually are effectively changing the fundamentals of the utility, but are key for our future. Those two sources are competing for funds, of course, and nevertheless, at some point, we have to kind of somehow come up with an ultimate investment plan that takes into consideration those demands and the objectives and constraints that we have in front of us. And to do that, one of the key elements that we're going to be thinking about is how to assess the value of everything that we do. I think Javier made a very good point, that is the issue of stranded assets. You could argue that the stranded asset is an asset that has lost its value in the sense that it's not contributing to the organization anymore, and yet our tendency very often is to continue investing in the assets that we have, where maybe it would be time to say, hold on a second, these assets are actually not worth much to us anymore. There's better ways of spending funds. So assessing the value of every single investment is actually key, and we'll come back to that in a second. The traditional way, or the way that most utilities are evolving in this context, is really to move from condition, asset condition. I'm looking at my existing assets, I'm looking at their condition, and I'm deciding what to do on those assets, how to intervene. More and more we're moving to the concept of risk, which is actually correct in the sense that condition is half of the story, because that tells you the likelihood that the asset will fail. But of course the consequence of that failure is just as important. If the consequence is insignificant, then who cares about the asset failing? On the other hand, if the consequence is huge, then obviously we're going to spend a lot of money making sure it doesn't happen. So the little diagram here shows me the fact that, my current condition, I can project forward into a potential degradation of my assets. I can turn that into a likelihood of failure into the future. And if I multiply that by the consequence of a failure, then I actually have a risk forecast. And that's what I want. Once I have a risk forecast, I can actually start making good decisions for my existing assets. And I can do that in two different time windows. I can try to model in the long term how my assets will behave looking forward, and that effectively gives me the need for funding and for resources that I will have into the future. So in other words, I'm kind of building up a shopping list of things that I'd like to do 10, 20, 30 years out maybe. And then in the shorter term, let's say for the next 2-3 budget cycles, I'm looking at projects that actually I really do want to undertake, that have been studied in some level of detail, and there I'm actually using risk to justify those projects, or at least in part. Justify them by actually saying, look, if I do this project, I'm going to mitigate so much risk. That actually is a key element in my decision making, and therefore in the execution of those projects. So that's something quite common. We see that more and more as being a foundational element for a lot of the business plans that are being built by utilities. And the base idea, of course, is that if I have a asset, and this asset over its life starts degrading, the baseline the baseline line that you see here, so the fixed line there, blue line, is essentially the overall cost that it takes me to run this asset. And of course, as the asset degrades, it's just costing me more and more. At some point, I'm going to say enough. And what I'm going to do there is I'm going to spend some money, some CapEx, to effectively reset that baseline, improve the condition of the asset or replace the asset. And in doing so, what I'm actually doing is effectively I'm spending a little bit of money, the area under the curve, the CapEx curve, to actually improve my OPEX, my aggregate OPEX, operating costs of the asset. And that's the area in between the curves on the top that I'm now kind of collecting as a benefit. So that's really the idea of lifecycle costing simplified, where you spend a little bit and hopefully you make more of it by effectively improving your operating conditions. Now, that is correct, except that I still need to determine at which point in time I actually should intervene on this particular asset, which I'm studying here. And there, the concept is also pretty well understood. It's what we call the economic end of life. Sorry, this used to have builds, but they disappeared in converting the slides over to this webinar, so it's all kind of coming at you in one shot. But what you're seeing here is that in today's dollars, generally speaking, the longer you wait, the better you're off as far as investing in an asset. So if I can delay an investment until tomorrow, just from a cost point of view, I'm generally speaking better off. Hence, the investment cost curve is kind of dropping over time. O&M in today's dollars is generally speaking relatively flat, so this is discounted dollars. Risk, though, the cost of risk in the sense of if an asset fails, what is it going to cost me, tends to at some point overwhelm the cost of money and starts kind of taking off, as you can see, the red curve. What I'm doing, therefore, is I'm adding those three curves together, and that gives me the total costs of operating this asset over time. And there is a minimum somewhere, and that minimum is essentially the point at which I should really reinvest. I should replace, refurbish, or do whatever action I need to do on this asset to actually make it more reliable, less risky again. And if I do it earlier, essentially I'm paying more for the safety of not screwing up, if you wish. If I'm doing it later, I'm gambling in the sense that I'm taking more risk, but of course I'm spending hopefully a bit less money gambling on the fact that the asset will not fail when it's supposed to fail. So this is the economic end of life. This allows me to time my investments. So if I take the two elements that I just discussed, the economic benefit and here the timing, then you can put those two together, turn this into a model, and essentially run it across your whole asset base. And in doing so, what I'm going to wind up with is a diagram like so, where on the left I see my typical investment plan, aggregate kind of budget of my investment plan before I've modeled the future, and on the right-hand side, I see it after I've modeled the future. On the left-hand side, what you'll see is that risk over time, the bottom diagram starts increasing because I am actually taking care of my assets in the short term, because we all think short term. We're too busy to think long term most of the time. But as you can see over the years, risk starts to increase. So I'm essentially building an unacceptable risk profile for my organization just from an asset failure point of view. Therefore, what I need to do is I really need to model, or I need to build a shopping list, as I was saying earlier, of things that I should do in the future, which are the purple bars on the right-hand side, which then kind of control my risk at the level at which I consider it to be acceptable for the organization. So by applying the principles that I just described, you can effectively predict this tsunami of work that is coming towards you, but you might not have quantified, and take this to your CFO, in this case to Javier, and say, Javier, this is actually what we're really facing. Based on our existing asset base, based on our needs, this is the kind of financial profile that we're looking for as far as investments or reinvestment in our existing assets. So that's predicting your future, and that's obviously very key, because the more certainty you have about how the future looks, the better you can prepare for it. So in other words, on my little diagram, this is what I see on the left here is I'm going to use analytics, modeling basically to look at my existing assets, and out of that develop a long-term strategy, 20, 30, 50 years. It's a bit dependent also on what the regulator might want to see and what your board wants to see. Now that leaves me with the challenge that, as we heard from Javier, a lot of the asset base is being essentially challenged. There is growth in the network, both by population growth or by the fact that we're changing technologies, and that with that we need to put in new transmission lines and whatnot. There is this competitive argument that was brought forward. So there is many reasons why we might want to invest in our asset base which are not directly related to just sustaining the existing assets. And I would argue that this is increasingly true. And with that, you need a model to determine which assets or which investments you should favor, which goes beyond just risk mitigation. And that's, of course, the value-based approach. So you're looking at the value that the assets that you're investing in are bringing to the organization, again, with the idea of, for instance, avoiding these stranded assets that Javier was speaking about. Now, this is something which is very central to the new standard for asset management, ISO 55000. If you think of it, it is completely driven by the fact that assets are there to essentially generate value for the organization and for its stakeholders, and therefore, if assets do not generate value, well, then there are liabilities, as one of my friends used to say, and therefore you should stop investing in them and you should put your money elsewhere. So understanding how you create value within your asset base is absolutely key, and it's kind of the natural companion to risk in a way, in the sense that you could argue that mitigating risk is protecting value, but you might also have other ways of generating value, which also means that you have to have the ability to therefore compare projects that are competing for funds, which might be extremely different. Here's 3 examples, 1, 2, 3 there, different colors, where you can see that one project increases the reliability of your asset base or a particular asset in a significant way and has a big contribution there, whereas project number 2 is much more around productivity and safety risk reduction, and number 3 is more about environmental benefits and maybe employee engagement or whatever metric you have there. So you can see that different projects might be contributing to very different factors. A key element, therefore, is the ability to compare these different projects, which are very different on a common scale. And for that, what we do is we kind of develop these value frameworks in which we're trying to quantify all the benefits that different projects bring to the organization and put them on a common scale so that I can literally add all my different benefits, as in this simplistic example on screen here, to come up with a net value of the 3 projects. And all things being equal and assuming I did my job well, therefore, project number 2 in this particular case is actually the one that brings the overall highest value to the organization. Now, if at some point the organization goes, well, safety is actually more important than that to us, so in other words, any project that contributes to safety needs to be promoted higher up, then you just change the weight of how you're essentially calculating the value, the safety value of particular projects. So you're essentially giving a bonus points to safety benefits, and that might change the ranking of the projects, of course. In this particular case, actually, it would improve even the score of project number 2. So that's the concept of value frameworks, which can be a blend of positive value creation in the sense of more productivity, better customer and or employee engagement, and it might also be avoiding negatives. So in other words, it's reducing risk, reducing customer interruptions, etc. So it can also be a protection of existing value or reduction of value destruction, if you wish. So we do this for all assets, of course, not only the ones that are top of mind. Javier pointed out very rightly that very many organizations, we tend to focus on the big investments and the number one investments, like tied directly to the productive assets. But all assets are assets. So in other words, what we're seeing increasingly in utilities now is organizations that actually apply such a logic across absolutely everything. IT projects, fleet, infrastructure, buildings are also assets. They have to be maintained. They have to be invested in. So you should put all your projects on the table, at least eventually, and apply the same logic to every single one of them to actually rank the projects accordingly and to make sure that the money goes where it has most merit. Now, there is challenges with all this, and one of them is, of course, the fact that investments will be competing for money, and therefore there's going to be losers and there's going to be winners. And one way to make sure that both the losers and the winners are exactly the right ones, and that you actually extract the absolute maximum value that you can out of your portfolio of competing investments, is actually to encourage or even force your troops to actually develop different alternatives for every project that they're putting on the table. So my little diagram here, what it's trying to explain is I had my 3 projects in my little portfolio there of candidate investments, the yellow, the blue, and the purple one. If I now have different ways of skinning the cat for every single one of those projects, as in the green little box. So my yellow project now has 3 different options or alternatives. Maybe there's a full rebuild, there is replace the assets, and there is just increased maintenance or something like that. The same is true for the blue and for the purple. Now all of a sudden what I have is I don't have 3 investments that I'm looking at. I actually have 11 investments that I'm looking at, which means that I can now begin choosing between 11 possible solutions to actually extract maximum value, which of course gives me much more flexibility with regards to which projects I can pick. Now there might be constraints to that, and as in obviously you don't want to pick 2 projects that solve the same problem. So there's a logic they have to put behind this, but you can see from a mathematical point of view and even intuitively that this actually is going to increase, generally speaking, the quality of the result that you're going to achieve, and it might actually also allow you to satisfy everybody. So rather than saying like, sorry, one of the 3 projects is not going to cut it, now you might actually be able to balance out the money in such a way that you can actually pick one of the options for every single of the 3 projects to actually achieve more for the organization. So this is the concept of optioneering, which again is very central to modern asset management strategy, and is certainly something that needs to be considered. The challenge, though, is of course what you're essentially doing is you're making your problem from a decision-making point of view more complex, and therefore very quickly you get into a situation where you have to kind of start putting systems in place to help you, and these systems, generally speaking, are called multi-criteria decision analysis systems, which are slightly more sophisticated than what you would normally do in a little spreadsheet where you would just rank your stuff very quickly. So in other words, what I'm looking at now is rather than having my single option as a solution for my project, which was option A there, I'm also considering B and C, which might have very different cost profiles, different execution profiles, different benefits. But when I put these in consideration with all my other projects, I might actually come up with a creative way of satisfying everybody and achieving more value for the organization as a whole. And then the very last point that I'd like to make is, of course, that irrespective of how good we are at choosing the projects that we're going to execute, there is always going to be things that will go sideways. And that's on the right-hand side of my diagram here, performance management, in the sense that when I'm executing on the project that I have approved, there might be cost overruns, there might be manufacturing delays, there might be winter storms which essentially create disruption or force me to actually do quick interventions in areas which I hadn't planned. So there's many different reasons why my beautiful portfolio that I had decided and worked out so carefully could get derailed. And therefore, what we're seeing now in more and more organizations is actually the fact that we're going to revisit our decisions on a pretty high frequency, maybe on a monthly or on a quarterly basis. I'm going to look at this whole portfolio again, and I'm going to say, okay, what changed? And based on those changes, how should I adjust my strategy? Very much like you would do for a financial portfolio if you have investments in the stocks. If the market changes, you're going to reevaluate your portfolio. Well, in a way, this is exactly the same thing. Your assets are in this case the ones that are driving the game, and the fact that you try to extract value out of your assets will drive you to revisit your portfolio potentially. So it's essentially taking a bit of a step back and seeing if you need to rebalance. So with that, what do we extract out of this, and observing what's the leading asset management practices are doing for the utilities out there, we see a couple of things happening. We see when they adopt these kind of more evolved thinking techniques and processes with regards to absolute investment planning, you wind up first of all with higher process efficiencies in the sense that you can automate a lot of this thinking that we discussed today. You actually can save costs in the sense that you can actually achieve the same results as you would have done before as far as value creation with less money by just having a more clever way of looking at different alternatives and options within your portfolio. And you can even literally avoid costs in the sense of demoting or even avoiding projects which effectively have a negative value. When you do a proper analysis, you'll discover they actually have a negative value to your organization. There's always 3, 5, 7% of projects within an organization which are just there because they've always been there. We've always done it this way. But actually, when you analyze them properly, they actually have no value or they have negative value to you. And with that in mind, you wind up with, of course, better risk management, which is key both to yourself but also to your insurer. So there's ways of saving money just by showing your insurer that you have a better risk management process in place now through asset management. You can indeed enhance the investment evaluations, as we just described. Your portfolio optimization can be much better if you apply a combination of value frameworks, optioneering, possible looking at different scenarios. Typically, you'll wind up with portfolios which actually do create more value to the organization for the same amount of investment or even for lower investment. And if you close the loop, as we just described, you can also enhance the delivery of the portfolio. And therefore, at the high level, you have the 5 key benefits that we see all the time is the corporate profile at risk level, improved stewardship, which is very important to your stakeholders. You're actually looking after the assets well today and for the future. Regulatory outcomes, if you have to put in rate filings, obviously having a robust business case very much goes in the sense of what Javier was describing as far as using perfect information to come up with the right dollars, right time, maximum value. Hence, improved financial performance, which will please everybody, and certainly the CFO. And important to your customers, of course, improved service levels. So this is something very real. We see it happening every day. We see a big evolution in many utilities that are starting to adopt such both methodologies, concepts, and tools. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Erin so that we can open it for questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Javier. Thank you, Boudewijn. That was great. So we are going to start the Q&A portion of today's webinar. So I've seen a few questions come in while our presenters were going through their presentation. So feel free to use that Q&A chat box in the right-hand side of your WebEx window to submit questions as we go through this last 15 minutes and take some questions for our experts. So Javier, a question came in for you while you were going over your presentation. With regulated utilities, ROI based on rate base, what incentive is there for utilities to spend money on O&M, particularly if the asset is fully depreciated?
Great. Well, let me give you the answer from a public power perspective. I am not a regulated utility, but my answer would be, well, it depends on the investment perspective, on the investment horizon you have. I believe that there's pressure, of course, from shareholders and boards to deliver shorter-term financial results, and that typically results in making investments that have a higher return on investment, even if those investments in the long term are not the most economical. So I think in this case, it's a conversation. It's an executive decision that has to come from the board of directors and the executives to say, are we willing to compromise the long-term health of the utility in order to get the benefits of a return on investment that a capital investment would generate, or are we willing to take the long-term view and use some of the graphs that Boudewijn was showing here, where we may be better off spending money on O&M because it is probably the cheapest way to run the utility, and we can pass on those benefits, financial benefits, to our shareholders and our ratepayers. That's from a regulated utility. From a public power utility, the answer is it's more simple. It's about our ratepayers. We don't have shareholders. To me, it is a decision about how to use our precious resources to deliver the lowest possible rate to our ratepayers. And capital investment is not always going to be the solution. Sometimes it might be OPEX, sometimes it might be CAPEX, but at the end of the day, I'm trying to lower overall the overall investment.
Boudewijn, I'd also like to. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I think Javier rightly pointed out at the very beginning that the landscape is changing quickly in utilities from a technological point of view and from an energy mix point of view. I think this is true from a regulatory point of view too. If you look around the world, even within North America, you see that regulators are also starting to shift their mind as to how to actually regulate utilities, and for good reason, of course, because they also see all these changes on the horizon, and that kind of forces the debate a bit. And with that, what we're starting to see more and more is both life cycle and outcome-based regulatory cycles, where the traditional way of rewarding you with a fixed, essentially, return on capital is kind of disappearing and is being replaced by something which is much more driven by, as Javier was pointing out, effectively, at the end of the day, what are you delivering to your stakeholders? So primarily to the ratepayers. So that's outcomes based. So if you're doing an investment, you're promising an outcome. Are you actually achieving that outcome? And you're actually going to be rewarded on achieving that outcome. So when you're not rewarded on spending money, you're rewarded on achieving an outcome, a positive outcome, of course, for your stakeholders. So that's a number one aspect, which is absolutely key. And the second one is this view where OPEX and CAPEX essentially are blurred, and the official term is TOTEX, which is total expenditure, which again is very close to what Javier was describing, where what you're really trying to do is to minimize TOTEX, because that, at the end of the day, will deliver the highest value to the ratepayers. So changes are coming, and even if today your regulatory regime is still pretty traditional, it might not be for the long time. So you have to get ready for what's coming next. So that's really what we're seeing, in particular California, Ontario, New York. You see these changes already happening. So it's not that far away.
All right, thank you both. So Javier, another question for you. In order to regulate the volatile nature of variable energy resources, wind in particular, RTO use fast-ramping gas generation. In the winter, gas supply is restricted. So what resources do you use to meet electric demand during the winter?
Well, in the case of OPPD, we use fossil fuels. We still have very healthy, well-operating coal plants, and we're using those. In the Midwest, the wind blows, and it blows a lot, very, very steady. So thankfully, I think the capacity factors we have on our renewable resources is higher than probably the rest of the country. However, you do need to have base load generation. For the rest of the country, I would say you have the traditional dispatchable generation in the form of nuclear, hydro, coal, and gas. For us, the solution is still coal generation.
Okay, thank you. So, Boudewijn, you mentioned analytics for the various analysis required. So what are some of the data sources required from utilities, and do most utilities, I guess, have the data needed?
That's a trick question, right? Data is always a beautiful subject because, of course, there is no right answer, and nobody has perfect data. So, unfortunately, this is the bad news for Javier. He wanted perfect information. I don't think that perfect information will ever be available. It'll always be somewhat imperfect. Nevertheless, certainly data helps, and the reason, very intuitively, data just helps because it removes the emotion out of the equation. That's the way I look at it. The more you can actually rely on data to tell you what's happening today and what might happen in the future, the easier the debate becomes internally as regards to what is therefore important and not. Now, this being said, today we all make decisions. Like every utility today, and for the last century, has made decisions and has kind of built a reasonable, reliable and stable business. So clearly, data is not strictly necessary in the sense of perfect data to actually run a utility. I think it's just a matter of gradual improvement over time. Obviously, if you want to predict the future and if you want to predict it in a way that is solid enough that you can take it to the bank or to your regulator, generally speaking, that means it has to be data-driven. So what we do see is an increasing focus on data collection campaigns. You might obviously start with your more critical assets because those are the ones that are going to carry the day. And from there, you start kind of building up a history, and this history, of course, will to a large extent help you predict the future with regards to where your assets are going. There's shortcuts. You can buy data. Literally, there's Zpryme and others have very good databases and models that you can kind of buy into to actually help you on this journey. There's, of course, tons of experts out there which can also help you. So it's not a matter necessarily of looking at this mountain and going, oh my God, it's going to take me 20 years to collect enough data on all my assets to actually do something meaningful. It's often a very gradual exercise, and it can be an assisted exercise in the sense that you can bring in outside help to kind of shortcut the whole the journey.
So, Boudewijn, another question for you, and I think it's really important. It kind of summarizes some of the other questions we have coming in. Is there more to this lost my place. Is there more to this investment than avoiding disaster? Is there a business case for replacing assets that perhaps aren't at end of life but could be replaced with a more efficient or more durable asset?
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to the diagram which I had, which showed you the economic end of life. And the economic end of life might be very different from both the fully depreciated, timing. You might depreciate an asset in 20 years because that's the way, you're told to do so. That doesn't mean to say that the asset is actually functionally at the end of its life after 20 years. And equally, you presumably don't want to really wait for the real end of life because that might be an expensive proposition if you run the asset to failure. So is there more to investing than avoiding disaster? Yeah. What you're trying to do is you're trying to kind of keep that TOTEX or that total cost of operating the asset, including investment, to the minimum. So it's important really as much as you can to find that economic end of life point, which is really the point at which if you reinvest at that particular moment in time, you can pretty much be assured that over the life of the asset, that is going to be the lowest cost point, everything thrown in, including, of course, risk. Now, the challenge with risk is that risk is an uncertain event in the future, so you might actually be wrong on your risk estimate, which brings us back to data, of course. So it's a bit of a conundrum there that you have to break by effectively kind of really bringing, if you don't have data, you have to bring in expert opinions to make sure that you do understand roughly what your risk profile is, and once you have that, you can actually calculate your end of life, economic end of life, and that's really the moment at which, optimally, if you have the money and the resources, you would want to reinvest in a particular asset.
So I'd like to hear, both Javier and Boudewijn, your points of view or your thoughts on this next question. And Javier, I'll let you take a stab at it first. Do you see significant investment into devices to collect real-time data to feed into condition-based maintenance models? Is there a growth trend? People are talking about Internet of Things sort of devices for asset management, but are there really any concrete examples? So maybe, Javier, if you want to address that first question, do you see significant investment into devices to collect real-time data to feed into condition-based maintenance models?
Yes. I do, and really quick to elaborate on that. I think the value of data is incredibly important, as Boudewijn just mentioned. accurate data, condition-based management, timely data is now at a peak demand, I would say, and the world is changing in front of us. The technology is changing, weather, climate is changing, legislative initiatives are changing, and the fastest you can get the data into the decision-making realm, the better off you're going to be. If that implies data gathering devices, all for it, right? There's no reason why a grocery store could have a barcode reader, and they've had those for 15 years, and we still have to go out and inspect things and spend a lot more time where we could be getting that information in a faster way.
So Boudewijn, piggybacking off of what Javier is saying, are you seeing growth in this trend? Are people talking about Internet of Things devices for asset management?
Of course they are, but then again, I like the grocery analogy, so I'm just gonna play with that one a little bit. Like the problem with the grocery analogy is, of course, at the grocery, the transaction is going to happen immediately as you're at the counter. As in, the barcode scanner is crucial because the teller person there needs to get your money within 10 seconds. So he needs to make up his mind as to what this thing is worth within 10 seconds and say, okay, well, the price is $10. Please pay me $10. Clearly, in utilities, if we're looking at asset management, most of the time, the decisions that we're making around our assets are not real time in the sense, if I'm going to replace a turbine or I'm going to replace a substation, it's not a matter of walking up to Javier and say, Javier, you need to make up your mind in 10 seconds. I need $20 million for this substation right now. It doesn't work that way. So with that, the need for real-time data is not nearly as crucial. And to put it a bit differently, information is also an asset, or data points are assets. They cost money. It costs us money to collect them. It costs us money to maintain them, as in keeping them accurate and timely, etc. So you always want to consider, how much are you going to spend on collecting data, because they have to have value. If they have no value to you, as in if they're redundant, because now I have too much information, then the value declines very quickly. So ironically, we still see a lot of assets today where maybe one assessment a year is perfectly fine. A lot of the larger assets and even the ones that you're looking at right now, as in your building, how many times a year are you going to assess your building condition? Well, clearly not real time. You're going to do it maybe even only every 5 years. That's good enough. So you really have to build this sliding scale of stuff for which real-time data is actually useful. And I would say that primarily it's useful for operational decisions, because those have to happen quite quickly. And then at the very other end, there is, condition data, which literally you can only collect, or you should only collect every 5 years, the condition of my building, and that's good enough, because the rate at which the building degrades, on the one hand, the risk of the building degrading, and the decisions that I have to make around them are such that a 5-year frequency is good enough. So now within the building, the air system might have sensors, but those sensors are primarily used to actually set the temperature and hold the temperature, as opposed to make me decide if it's time to replace the air system. Of course, it helps me in making that decision, but the value of that information for me to decide to change the air system is much lower than the value for me to actually manage the temperature in the building in the first place. So it's a matter of making sure that you don't overdo it. And hence, if I look at it right now, real-time data is primarily used for billing and for operational considerations, especially in transmission and in distribution, like smart grids, etc. When it comes to asset management in the sense of investment decisions, that's something in which we typically would subsample real-time data to actually get into something more reasonable that we can use to help organizations make decisions around capital planning.
All right, thank you. So that brings us to the end of our Q&A session. And I really want to thank Javier and Boudewijn for taking the time to be on this webinar today and share your insights with us. We really do. We appreciate it from both of you. So I'm going to go ahead and send things back over to Chris to close things out.
All right. I just want to also say thank you very much to Boudewijn and Javier for taking the time to chat today, and also to you, Aaron, for moderating a great discussion. As a quick reminder, everyone attending today's webinar will receive an email within the next couple of days with links to the webinar presentation deck and the webinar playback. If you have any other questions, you can always reach us at info@zpryme.com. And thank you again to Copperleaf for presenting this webinar. And from all of us at Zpryme, thank you for being a part of it. We hope you have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.